Hello, historiography students. I'm Eric Morningstar, and today we'll be talking about Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880 by W.E.B. Du Bois. I keep wanting to say Du Bois, but I know it's Du Bois. So, as always, we'll be discussing the book in terms of its argument, offering some summary comments and some critiques, and connecting the work to the concept of the dialectic. So, to argument then. On page 30, Du Bois says this. This is the end of his second chapter, which is interesting. Says that thus the majority of the world's laborers, by the insistence of white labor, became the basis of a system of industry which ruined democracy and showed its perfect fruit in World War and Depression. And this book seeks to tell that story. Interestingly, earlier on the page, he says, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again toward slavery. The whole weight of America was thrown to color caste. The colored world went down before England, France, Germany, Russia, Italy, and America. A new slavery arose. The upward moving of white labor was betrayed into wars for profit based on color caste. Democracy died, save in the hearts of black folk. So, interestingly, this isn't terribly clear. The writer of the introduction, David Levering Lewis, he actually quotes a reviewer who I think gives perhaps a bit more concise summation of the book's argument, which is actually pretty useful just as a tip to people who are watching. Always check the introductions and prefaces. They often will give you signposts and like where to look in terms of your reading for argument. Now on page 15 of the introduction, Lewis quotes Charles S. Johnson, who stated, the major thesis of this book is that the result of civil war was an enfranchisement of labor, black and white, but the entrenched bigotries of the landed oligarchy and the ignorant racial prejudices of white labor so weaken the strength of labor as to render it helpless before the forces of industrialism and capitalism. So, moving along. Now, the kinds of topics that are going to be discussed reach from before the Civil War, really as far back as the beginning of the nation, and all the way through Reconstruction. And Du Bois actually offers a pretty good summary of what things are going to be reading on page 132. And basically moving from colonial history to the Confederacy and afterwards. And on there he says, as the first point, Negroes after conversion to Christianity were in the same position as other colonials subject to the British king. This attitude disappeared early in colonial history. Number two, when the slave trade was stopped, Negroes would die out. Therefore, the attack upon slavery must begin with the abolition of the slave trade, and after that, the race problem would settle itself. This attitude was back of the slave laws from 1808 to 1820. If Negroes did die out, started three, and if gradually by emancipation, the economic failure of slavery, they became free, they must be systematically deported out of the country, back to Africa or elsewhere, where they would develop into an independent people or die from laziness or disease. This represented the attitude of liberal America from the end of the War of 1812 down to the beginning of the Cotton Kingdom. And as a fourth point, he says, Negroes were destined to be perpetual slaves in a new economy, which recognized a caste of slave workers. And this caste system might eventually displace the white worker. At any rate, it was destined to widen expansion toward the tropics. Or wider expansion toward the tropics. This was the attitude of the Confederacy. And then post, most of the book discusses how the planter class, thinking that it was a big mistake to go ahead and just free the slaves, and the way that they kind of sold that was to say that, well, you know, these people are ignorant, can't be educated, lazy. They're basically going to have an existence that's worse than what they had as slaves. So nice of them. And yeah, then they join up with the poor working whites to limit opportunities for education, instill this Jim Crow type of laws and basically derail Reconstruction. But if we go back to the different kinds of things that Du Bois discusses in this work, he discusses like the conditions of black and white labor. Black labor in the South, I mean, the blacks were slaves. They had no rights. They were treated like chattel. Could be bought and sold between planters. The families could be broken up via slave auctions. Even people in the border states, after the stoppage of exporting or importing, slaves, they basically could breed their own and then send them off to slave auctions to be sold. It's something that Du Bois says that the people in the border states didn't want to talk about, but at the same time, that was the reality of the situation. Interestingly, in discussing the attitudes of the poor whites leading up to the Civil War, and this continues even after, essentially they were concerned about competition for jobs. A lot of these people were European immigrants. They came over and really had to compete for skilled and unskilled labor. So the attitude among some of them was that, well, if we emancipate the blacks, then what's going to happen to our jobs? And interestingly, on page 18, Du Bois kind of focuses on the Irish a little bit. And he says that the Irish sided with the South in the system of slavery because of the competition for jobs. And then this led to race riots in cities like Cincinnati and Philadelphia. There were riots in New York. Interestingly, he doesn't discuss the burning of Memphis after the Civil War, which was also, that incident was started by the Irish, if you read the book Death in Memphis. Just an interesting thing to consider, really, how the conflict between blacks and whites has a class component. In discussing the attitudes of the planters, leading up to Civil War, taking a look at page 39, Du Bois states, the espousal of the doctrine of Negro inferiority by the South was primarily because of economic motives and the interconnected political urge necessary to support slave industry. But to the watching world, it sounded like the carefully thought out result of experience and reason. And because of this, it was singularly disastrous for modern civilization in science and religion, in art, in government, as well as in industry. The South could say that the Negro, even when brought into modern civilization, could not be civilized, and that therefore he and other colored peoples of the world, so far inferior to the whites, that the white world had a right to rule mankind for their own selfish interests. Well said, Mr. Du Bois. So how did the planners rationalize what the heck evil they were doing? They came out and they said, oh, well, the blacks can't be educated. They're lazy. You know, we find justification in things like theories of economics and government, but really, I mean, it's all about maintaining their own economic power. Moving on, the chapter called The General Strike, this runs from about page 55 to 83 in this edition. Now, the story here is that the blacks really had to decide, coming up to the Civil War and at the start of it, and as the war went on, what are we going to do? So a lot of the planter class here, the very tippy top, the 1%, if you will, you know, they were exempt from fighting in the war because they could to remain on the plantation, working with the slaves, and they could continue their system of agriculture and economy in the South. Whereas all the poor whites, we can send them off to war to fight. So what are the blacks supposed to do? Are they supposed to help the Confederacy by continuing to do their work? Well, some did. You know, it's not just rich white folk can have this opinion about, what's the condition going to be like for me outside of this system. I mean, that was something that Black people had to think about as well. So some stayed, some did decide to leave and run to the lines. And of course, people in the Union weren't explicitly fighting for the emancipation of slavery. They wanted to, the narrative at the time was really about restoring the Union. Du Bois quotes him, but I'm sure most of us know that Lincoln said that, if I could win or reunite the Union without freeing the slaves, I would. If I could do it without freeing and with, I would do that too. So, and that was something that was picked up all over. That wasn't something that Lincoln said alone. That was a lot of the attitude of people in the border states as well. So for those who did make it over to the Union side then, it's like saying, I am not going, that's why the idea of general strike being a labor movement puts, it conceptualizes the Black force in this way. But then when they get over to the Union side, because, the Blacks were forced to help build Confederate defenses. So really it was like, okay, why are we assisting in fighting this war? So you go over to the North, and it is eventually over there that the desire to arm the Blacks and have Blacks fight on the side of the Union really came about. So once it was acceptable, and it wasn't acceptable easily for Union Army officials to really accept the notion that Blacks would be fighting alongside with whites. But Blacks were willing and able to do that, and that was some of the fear, like, oh, we're not going to be any good on the battlefield. But the truth of the matter is that with the military labor that the South would have in using their slaves, the North would have been at a disadvantage. They just didn't have the numbers. And in this, Du Bois really, talks about how, the next chapter of the book is called The Coming of the Lord. And a lot of, this comes up on page 87, talking about the significance in religion, the religious narrative about Blacks fighting on the Union side, that really this was a rallying cry to really achieve fighting for emancipation and fighting for the Union against the system of slavery. And basically, the very reality of having Blacks fight on the Union side forced the North to really come out and say, hey, guess what? This is what the war is about now. We're going to end slavery. Interestingly, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free slaves everywhere, didn't free them in the border states. But nevertheless, that became more of the narrative as the war went on and Blacks became involved in the fighting. In terms of where did it go afterwards? Again, returning to this idea of the planters and the poor whites joining forces together to really, in an almost just petulant way, saying, "Oh, we're going to do everything we possibly can to basically heal our, lick our wounds, so to speak, and really stick it to the newly freed African Americans." So, yeah, in terms of critiquing this book, part of me really has to remember when this book was written. In the introduction, Lewis points out this book did not receive a lot of the attention that it deserved when it was originally written. Du Bois writing this at the time wouldn't have had access or would have had difficult access to really getting to a lot of more authoritative sources. I'm not going to critique this book in terms of its lack of sources. And I'm going to do that just because these difficulties really have to be taken into account. As a historian writing today, I don't think that this really is the authoritative text that we would be using because, you know, using quotations that aren't cited, figures that aren't cited, it becomes that this book is extremely useful as a way of understanding how history could be written during this time and about a subject that was just so fraught with controversy. I mean, really, reading that the Dunning School is talking about how the failures of Reconstruction were due to African Americans. I mean, a revisionist history was certainly needed at this time. This book really answered the call. I highly recommend it. I don't have so much of a problem with this book as a whole. If I'm going to say anything, because I feel that I should address something that I do find wrong with this book. And in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and agree that at times Du Bois's language can seem overly emotional. I think that in his emotion, sometimes he glosses over things that could need a little bit more clarification. For example, taking a look at page 17, he's talking about the conditions and prosperity potential in the early years of the nation. And he says, to quote, the opportunity for real and new democracy in America was broad. Political power at first, as usual, confined to property holders and an aristocracy of birth and learning, but it was never securely based on land. Land was free, and both land and property were possible to nearly every thrifty worker. Birth began to count for less and less, and America became to the world a land of opportunity. Yes, to a certain degree, right? How much Du Bois would have really, I mean, I'm sitting here thinking immediately of all these early histories that I've read, but I'm not sitting here thinking about when they were written. So whether or not, Du Bois would have had the same kind of sources that we have today to make these claims, I can't really comment on that. I can comment on the number of things that I've read and how we brought in people over who wanted to develop land and property and prosper for themselves. But even in the early years, land prospectors and surveyors swallowed up a lot even before the Revolutionary War. The book Forced Founders talks about this a lot. I mean, that's where some of Native American racism came from, is because, we want to really compete with these wealthy landowners who are buying up all of the stuff that we want so we can develop for ourselves. Whose fault is it? I can't challenge these richer white guys, so it must be the devil Native Americans on the side who are really, putting a stopper on my potential. So, I mean, in terms of that, like I said, that's not central to Du Bois's argument in this book, but it is something to consider while reading. Pay attention to what really elicits a lot of emotion from Du Bois. So, in closing, because I'm reaching critical mass again, it is important to consider the dialectic here. One, because the very nature of this book being a revisionist history says, okay, here's all this evidence, which, I mean, even today, if we're looking at the economic motivations to maintain the system of slavery in the Civil War, all of that's really supported. And you take that kind of argument against the Dunning School that thought that African Americans were responsible for it. It's almost a shameful meeting of two different schools of thought because of everything that we know now. But in that essence, at the time of Du Bois writing this revisionist history, that wasn't the case. So it is always important, just cannot emphasize that enough. to take even the current accepted historical narratives that we are given by our texts, by our politicians, and to question them, to critique them, because it might lead to generational understanding. So thank you for watching. I will look forward to discussing this book more in depth tomorrow.